Hi, and welcome to VIBEZ Daily. This is a daily devotional curated by VIBEZ Church to help you practice the way of Jesus and be all that God has called you to be. You have joined us for our year-long series titled Devoted. Acts 2:42 tells us that the followers of Jesus were devoted to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to breaking of bread, and to prayer. This podcast was created to provide context and commentary for what you read each day. Just before our friends begin discussing today's reading, we want to invite you not only for fellowship, but for prayer as well. We have created the VIBE Daily Chat Group to offer you fellowship and a community where you can state your observations, ask questions about the reading or the podcast. You can join us by downloading the VIBEZ Church app in your favorite app store. Click Join the Conversation and join us today. And finally, we hope that you can join us for prayer. Prayer happens Monday through Friday, and more information on that can be found on the VIBEZ Church app under prayer. Now, let's begin our conversation on today's reading.
All right, welcome to day 9 of the Devoted Reading Plan. We are covering 3 chapters today, chapter 22, 23, and 24 of Genesis. Let's just jump right into it. Last left off with the birth of Isaac, as well as the covenant that Abraham made with Abimelech. And now we're here in chapter 22, and it should be chapter 10 according to Collin, because there's a test that's coming here for Abraham. And so I won't dive too much into it, man. Let's just jump into what were your observations? What stood out to you about the way that God tested Abraham with this sacrifice of Isaac?
I would say in verse 2, it stuck out when he said, take your son, your only son. Mm-hmm. I was like, wait a minute. He's not acknowledging Ishmael. This is your only son. I think it was really interesting because even in chapter 21, when we talked about it yesterday, when he sent off Hagar, the Lord never acknowledges Hagar as Abram's wife. It was like your slave woman. Yeah. And so I think this is emphasis that this is the plan that I've ordained for you, and this is what it is. This is Isaac. This is your only son. Take him. So I think it's interesting.
Yeah.
I love how in verse 3, God has asked Abraham to sacrifice his son, and Abraham doesn't plead with him. He just responds and does exactly what he says.
Yeah.
Early.
It's the growth for me. Yeah. This evolution of faith and just this immediate obedience. Yeah, it's cool to see. And knowing man, Abraham has waited how long for Isaac? You know, this promise and this desire just to possibly give him back indefinitely, take his life. I think that was wild. But I do love seeing God still wanting to see where Abraham's heart was, his heart posture of okay, are you willing to put any and everything, including your loved ones, before me? Or are you really fearing me, in a way that I would hope that you would? So that testing just really showed Abraham's heart. And I was even thinking to myself, I was like, man, how many times have God tested me just to see what was hidden in my heart? Mm-hmm. And I failed. Yeah. Literally I failed because I'm no, God, you could get everything else, but this one thing, I'm not going to give that to you. Or just this hesitation, or, just holding on to things with my fist closed. And so it definitely convicted and challenged me for sure. Cause I think about the dearest things that have, been close to my heart. Would I be the one to be so willing to give it back to God? And he's rightful to have it. Yeah. He doesn't want any other God before him. And so, I think that was a point for Abraham to show, did he love God for real? And did he idolize his son in a way to where he wasn't willing to sacrifice him?
Yeah. And I love how, when he did it in full obedience with all the provisions that he needed. So, sometimes when God tells me to do stuff, I'm okay, I'm going to somewhat do it. But he got up, got him early, got the donkey, he had wood, he had the fire, he had a knife, he had everything that he needed to actually follow through with what God had asked him to do. And I think that was really interesting because sometimes God asks me to do stuff and I don't do what I need to do to follow through in all of it.
Yeah. And I've always just been blown away, and it kind of follows up with what you said, Shameeka, here, that like in verse 16, what God says to Abraham, he says, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, I will indeed bless you and make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky and the sand of the seashore. It's that word because that challenges me so much, because God had already promised all of these things to Abraham.
Right.
Yet he says, because you did this, I will actually keep my word and follow through. And I was like, to me, I was like, God, like he hadn't done enough at this point already. Like he hadn't already shown enough faith to have received what it is that you had promised him. But it's like, it seems like God was just clear that I still need to test you once I fulfill the promise. Like, it's one thing in the wait. It's another thing that once I give you what I promised you, will you now worship that over me?
Yeah.
Right? Like, and that's what I feel like God was saying, is that now I've given you what you wanted, what you desired, what I told you I would give you. Will you worship that over me? Because now I want to make sure that you would still give that up for me. And I don't know. I've always been challenged by that. That it's like, okay, God still says, I still have one more test. I still have one more thing. I want to make sure that you don't actually worship that instead. And then that is ultimately why God fulfills his promise to him. And so I don't know, like it always struck me, because when I first read it, like, I was just like, really, God? Like he had to do that too. Yeah. But I do think that was the core of it for him. The core of it was, will you worship Isaac more than me? Because now that I've given you that promise, do you no longer need me? Yeah. And so I don't know. That was just to piggyback on what you said. Like that test and that challenge has always been really just eye opening for me.
And I think that's so good. And the one thing that stuck out to me was that the angel calls out to him and says, Abraham, Abraham, when he's getting ready to sacrifice the son. And then the angel provides the ram. Yeah. And what I imagine is happening is like Abraham is celebrating the fact that he has a ram now and he doesn't have to sacrifice his son. And then in the verse after that, it says, then the angel called out to Abraham a second time and then gave him the promise. And so I think the application is that don't get so caught up in your miracle that you miss the promise, because the Lord is still speaking even after your miracle. But you can get so caught up in the moment that you miss what he's trying to show you.
That's true.
Man, that's sweet.
And as a mother, I don't even think the Lord would have to have given me this promise of a child for many years for it to be like wrestling in my heart to do this. Like, I don't care if this was just like a one-off child, like, oh, didn't expect to have this baby, but then to lay the baby out, like lay the child out and grab a knife and about to go to town, like, I think that's just what makes Abraham so great in terms of his faith, because I'm like, who would do that? Right. Like, who would actually attempt to do this to anybody that they love, let alone your own child? Like, but I don't know if Abraham thought like, well, maybe he'll resurrect them, or maybe like, I don't know what he might have thought the Lord could do at this point. But to me, I think the gravity was, I was really trying to think like, man, would I have taken any one of my 4 children and laid them out and held up a knife and literally was about to like kill them because God told me to? Like, that's hard. I have a hard time getting up in the morning when the Lord tells me to get up, right, and pray. Like, let alone doing something like this. Yeah.
So if I can provide some context around this verse, like my professor, he kind of broke down this verse and it blew my mind. So later on in Deuteronomy, you see God's name, Molech and Marduk, and their child sacrificing gods. And so in this point in Abraham's life, he's still learning about Yahweh. So they have subscribed to a lot of Canaanite religions and Canaanite gods that he has to work out of. So in this verse, it actually takes Abraham more faith to not kill his son than to actually kill his son. Like, he's going up the mountain expecting to kill his son because he thinks that's what Yahweh wants. That in order to have relationship with Yahweh, I need to kill Isaac. But what Yahweh is saying is, I'm different than all of these Canaanite gods. I don't require you to kill your son, because ultimately I will kill my son. But Yeah, and I think it's important to understand here that this is not about just Abraham and God. This is Yahweh versus all of the other Canaanite gods and other religions.
Yeah,
that's good.
Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
That's a good distinction, because I think that even like let's call it what it is. A lot of us have grown up in church. I know Shameeka, I think your story kind of came to faith a little later in life, but like for those of us that did grow up in church, we've heard this story countless times, and we've probably been desensitized to the idea that like God would ask Abraham to kill his son.
Yeah.
Right. But there are a lot of people who really wrestle with like, why would God even ask this in the first place? Right? Like, why would he ever put him in this kind of position? And I think what you shared is helps with that context that like in this time, this was a regular practice among pagan people.
Exactly.
Right? So it's not as if, for us, we were like, what? Like, why would anybody ever do this? Right? In our context, in our day, but to kind of contextualize it and help to understand that for those readers, even right, even I'm assuming when this is written and put to paper, that the people who are reading this, that it's ultimately authored for, even they would understand that this was common practice at that time. This is not something that's mind blowing in the way that we're repulsed by it.
Yeah.
In that same way. So I appreciate you sharing that context. I think that helps us even understand that.
Yeah.
Anything else from Abraham's test here, and God's asking him to sacrifice of Isaac?
I was just going to say, and you touch bases on it, just like I love seeing the foreshadowing of Jesus, how it does talk about like Isaac being the only son, like you hear that language, only son, but then also in verse 8, Abraham said, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering. And so, yeah, I just immediately thought of like Jesus being that sacrificial lamb for us, and this being a great like foreshadowing of that happening.
Yeah.
Good. So after that, we get a little quick kind of glimpse into Rebecca's family, just kind of her lineage, and that'll be important later down the line. But then we get to Sarah's burial, get a little bit of not just that she was buried, but ultimately this establishes what became a graveyard or a cemetery for the family of Abraham kind of down the line. Was there anything that jumped out to you guys in chapter 23 about kind of that coming of burying Sarah and some of what that arrangement was specifically between he and the people of that land?
Yeah. What stuck out for me was how well respected Abraham was. Like the Hittites were just willing to give him whatever. Like they even told him, like, I consider you a prince. Like it was like an honor for them to be able to provide a space for Sarah. And so we just really see at this point, like he was just well respected and honored by these men.
Yeah, and I think, it's important to understand the significance of this moment. The reason why Abraham is going back and forth with Ephron is because it validates his stake in the promised land. This is the land that God has called for him and the Israelites. And so now he's not thinking just about Sarah, he's thinking about future generations.
Yes.
And so if anybody comes and says, this land is not yours, now he has literally bought it. He wasn't just given it. And so he understands the significance, not of this moment, but just of this land.
Thank you for bringing context to that, because I was wondering like why he just really felt the need to like, no, I need to put money down on this. Like, but that definitely does make sense, because it eliminates any kind of rebuttal that anyone could have of like, well, technically it was given to you. You ain't really paid for it. So that's good.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that. It's so good.
No, I loved that, because it, to me, I feel like it's a great example, again, just practical application for us. It was a great example of just like establishing like legacy and like really how we pass on generational wealth, right? In our families. And I think like Abraham set a good example of that, because you're right. He was definitely looking out for everybody after me may not have the same favor and grace that I have, right? Like they may choose to do something else with it. They may, go a different direction. They move away, whatever the case may be. But I know that if they need something and they need a place to bury their dead, it'll be set. Because I have it. Like I've done my part. And I think for us, it's a challenge for so many of us are only thinking about us in our lifetime and what we have, and how much are we investing in those that do come after us, right? And spending the time to say, look, I'm going to pass this on and this on and this on to where you don't have to worry about it. Like, even just from a practical standpoint, I mean, that's just one less cost for their next generation, right?
Yeah.
Like one less thing that they have to pay for or think about or invest in because he's like, I've already done this. Yeah. I've set that up for you. And I do love this example, very early example for us that helps us even maybe reflect on, okay, what are we leaving behind for others? What are we investing in now that will ultimately others can benefit from down the way?
Yeah. And to your point, like, I think we mentioned this in a previous episode of like just Abraham being this traveler, but you really see him like establishing things in these places that he went. And so I wonder if it was intentional on his behalf to be like, hey, like, I'm trying to cover ground.
Yeah.
And the beauty of like him being in those spaces, how ultimately like he wants to establish a people and a nation that's going to revere the Lord. Yeah. And that's what God's desire is as well. So yeah.
Yeah. Good. Well, again, it's a brief chapter, but we get to kind of a longer story here. Abraham makes it a point to find a wife for Isaac, which kind of dominates a lot of chapter 24 for us. And there's a whole story there, right? So this gives us a lot of context. We don't always get as much of the details as we do get in chapter 24. Talk to me about the story of Isaac and Rebecca. Anything that just jumped out to you guys about this story and how Isaac gets his wife?
Yes. I'm like, yes. Just seeing the journey of this servant, like in the process of finding Rebecca, like one, he was honoring Abraham in what he had like, you know, pledged to him that he would do. Abraham was very specific, like, hey, I'm not looking for my son to marry no Canaanite woman, or like, don't take him back to this specific land. He like gave him clear instructions, and there was weight to that. And the fact that this servant ultimately has opportunities to worship God, to pray to God, to like really ask for God's provision and to see it fulfilled. That really stuck out to me, because again, like you hear often the language of like the God of Abraham or whatever. Like, you know, we probably wouldn't know for sure if this servant was a believer, but he's like, I know a man who knows this God. And you know, he tried him out. And so that whole process, I love how specific he was, and like, make sure that I know it's a sign from you that this is the wife that you have for Isaac, if these things line up as far as like what happens at the well, and everything. And just a favor again of like it actually being someone within the family that Abraham desired. And ultimately just this man sharing his testimony, like you see him repeat verbatim exactly what happened. He was like, okay, this happened and I said this and Abraham said this. And at first I was thinking like, why is he giving all these details? But this was this man sharing his testimony. Like he was sharing his testimony of like, man, I got to see God through this. This is how it happened from start to finish. And look, and as a result, like they're like, oh, we can't say nothing then. Like this clearly the Lord's hand is on this. They're like, we're not about to argue with God. Like clearly the Lord's hand is in this. And it did become a successful trip where he found a wife for Isaac. So yeah, I really enjoyed seeing this story.
Yeah, I think that was the same thing that I highlighted. Like in verse 12, he prays. Like he prays, oh Lord. Yeah. Right? And I just love that part. I'm like, wow, like you've been watching Abraham all this time, and now you have learned how to pray. And then even in verse 29, in verse 35, he says, the Lord has greatly blessed my master. And so I love this continuous acknowledgement of the Lord. Like, not my master has become this great wealthy man, but it was like, no, the Lord has. And so I love that he hasn't taken the Lord out of this whole rhetoric.
And I love, like you were saying, Victoria, like it showcases his faith, the fact that he goes to the Lord first. But it always brings me joy in verse 15. It says, before he had finished praying, the Lord answers his prayer. And you know, just even jumping down to Rebecca, like I think about Rebecca minding her business and doing what she needs to do for her family.
Yeah.
And she sees the servant is thirsty. And she could have easily just given the servant water, but she takes the time to go and give each of the camels water.
Yeah.
And there's 10 camels. So there's a test involved.
Yeah.
And so I was doing some research one day and I was like, you know, how much water do camels drink? And it says like they drink like 10 gallons. And I'm like,
Wow.
do you know how much time it would have taken Rebecca to
draw water?
exactly
Yeah.
for each camel?
Yeah.
But it just speaks about the favor of going above and beyond what you're asked to do.
Yeah.
Because she didn't even know what was tied to her obedience.
Right.
Wow.
The generosity, man, like she was willing to welcome in a stranger, a man that she didn't know, into her house, like with her family. Like didn't even discuss it with them first. Like, let me go check and see. Like, you just really don't see that often nowadays because, you know, I can speak for myself. Like, it's easy to have trust issues of like, well, I don't really know you or anything, but the generosity across the board was something beautiful to see, and it showed her heart.
Yeah, it reminds me of what, you know, Jesus taught about, like someone asks you to go a mile, like go 2, right? Or just to like do that extra bit. And yeah, that's what Rebecca's like, okay, you needed some. Well, I'm not gonna just take care of you. I'm gonna take care of everyone. And to your point, I do think, you know, often I you know, feel challenged and convicted of how do I just do the bare minimum? Like, you know, this is what somebody needs. I'm gonna do the absolute minimum of what it takes to meet that need versus like, how can I go above and beyond to bless this person, right? To do more to them. But I've always loved, and you know, Shameeka, you alluded to this, but just like the specific, how specific his prayer was. The specificity is the word I was trying to pull up there, but of his prayer, and like, and how it predated seeing Rebecca, right? Like, it wasn't as if all of this took place and he said, oh, maybe this is a sign from the Lord, right? It was like, I know it will be a sign if this happens. And so when this happens, this is now confirmation of what I've been praying for. And I think, you know, very often we like to, you know, see things happen and then just try to like post date God's, you know, confirmation, right? Let me just go back and post date his sign to like, this must be a sign from the Lord, instead of just saying like, God, you know, and we see this again later, Gideon does something similar, but like, it's just this idea of like, God, I'm looking for you. And this is how I will know you showed up, right? And so when this happens, now I can just easily point out and you know, also it's asking for something that is unlikely to happen. Right? Like, he didn't just say like, the first woman to come up here. When a woman comes to the well, I know it's you, Lord. Like, somebody coming to the well, like a woman gonna come to the well, right? That's not specific enough, but it's like, if she comes and does this, you know, and then gets additional confirmation when he finds that she's from, you know, his master's home and whatnot. So I just love, just specific when I think about my own prayers, like, how can I be specific? Like, God, this is what I'm seeking you for. This is what I'm looking for. And this is how I know that if you do this, that, and whatever else, then like, God, I know you spoke. And if not, then I'm not gonna move, right? Like, how do I pray and with such specificity? It was kind of like one of my takeaways.
It definitely takes faith. Like, I know for me, the times I'm not specific, it's because I'm fearful that it won't happen and I don't want to get my hopes up. Like, let me just go ahead and soften the blow because I'm going to ask for the minimum. And that's why I really do appreciate him and even Abraham with the whole Sodom and Gomorrah, going back to that. Like, it takes faith. Like, it takes boldness and confidence to go to the Lord and be that specific.
I also think it for me speaks to like a willingness to submit to God's will, right? When you're specific like that and you are looking for a specific sign and you know that it'll be a clear yes or no, one of the other fears is it's a no, right? When I'm asking for a yes, and that I won't get what I asked for, but am I willing to submit to his will, like regardless, right? Like if he says no, like, am I willing to accept that? And I think that's the other thing, right? If I keep it vague, then I can probably talk myself out of like whatever it was. If I keep it vague, then when it don't happen exactly the way, I got a justification and a way around it so I can still get what I want out of this, right? And I can still make it happen. But when I'm specific, I actually open myself up to a very clear no, as well as a clear yes. And I have to also be willing to accept that.
Yeah.
Anything else from their story?
I think it was just so funny to me that we get down to after the whole story and they say, yeah, she can go with you. And then they try to renege like, oh, can she just stay with us for a few days? And later we'll see Laban and his trickery with Jacob and Rachel and stuff. So it's like, when I read it, so I was like, here they go starting to play some games already. Mm-hmm. But I love how the servant was adamant, like, no, I had an assignment. We're leaving. Like, let's go. Yeah. And so I do see, like you said, part of the character of Laban, their family, right? Yeah. That, like they was up to something already.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think with that, verse 55, let the young woman remain with us 10 days.
Right.
Here we go. There's another test.
Yeah.
And it just speaks to the urgency of the moment.
Yes.
Because, he needs to find Sarah because, like, as we'll see in the next chapter, Abraham's death is imminent.
Yeah.
So, yeah. If he would have waited any longer, it could have held up so much.
Yeah, that's true.
And they said at least 10 days in my version for ESV. It says at least 10 days. And so I was like,
they would have kept adding days on.
It could have been like, well, we said at least.
But also, it speaks to me, it speaks to a selfishness on like Laban's part, right? Mm-hmm. Because like, based off of everything that's been presented to him, Rebecca got the opportunity of a lifetime right now.
Yeah.
Right? To marry Isaac, to be in the home of Abraham. Like, this is like, this is what you've been waiting for your whole life almost, right? This kind of opportunity. But all Laban and them can see is what it means for them.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I'm losing a sister.
Yeah.
Right? And it's like, it's what it means for me. And I think it's so challenging for me because I'm like, how often do I want to withhold someone's potential because of how it impacts me?
Yeah.
Right? Like, how often am I in a place where I'm like, no, I don't really want you to take that job because that means you got to leave this job, right? Or you got to leave where I'm at, right? Or I don't want you to chase this dream or go and do that because then I got to replace you somehow, or I got to figure out, or it's going to break my heart, or you know, whatever. Like, how often am I trying to hold somebody back from what they ultimately have the opportunity to achieve and what God is trying to do in their life because of what it means for me?
Yeah. And
I just think, like I said, it's just this. I look at Laban, I'm going, man, that's flat out selfish. Now again, I think about myself, I'm like, okay, I've probably been selfish too, but like, it's just. It's all about them when they asked that request. It wasn't for her. They didn't say she needs to stay 10 days because she wants to be here. It was like me, because once they asked her, she was like, no, I'm good. Like, I'm ready to go.
Yeah.
But it was all about them. And it blew my mind on that too.
And I wonder if part of it too, it's just my thought and thinking, there's nothing in the text that says this, but I wonder if like part of them was thinking like the longer they stay, the more like gifts they could get possibly, or more he could like swindle. Okay. Because like he not only brought out gifts for Rebecca, but he brought out gifts to Laban and the mother too. Yeah. And so I was wondering if like maybe he was trying to figure out a way to like negotiate more, or finagle some more from him.
And that selfishness is why verse 8 makes sense, because Abraham says, only do not take my son back there.
Yeah.
Because Abraham knows about his past country. And the danger is that if he would have taken the son there with him, that they would have, familiarity breeds contempt. And so they would have ingratiated themselves so much with Isaac that Isaac's would have foregone the land of Canaan and would have tried to get back to Laban and the rest of the family.
Yeah. That's good. That's good. Anything else? I know this is rich. There's a long chapter here, kind of a lot of subtleties, but anything else that just jumped out to you guys about the servant's journey, about Isaac, Rebecca, any of that?
I think it was just hilarious that, like, I was telling you the other day, I think it's hilarious that, like, she gets to Isaac and he's just like, oh, who that? And, like, the servant explains the story. And he's like, okay, cool, come to my tent. Like, there's no courting. Like, you didn't see, like, no time in the baths. Like, back in the day, when it was serious. Like, oh, this my wife? right, girl, come on, get in this tent real quick. Like, I just thought it was so interesting, like how fast it was. Like,
Yeah.
there was no need to just like fill her out. I don't know if she's the one. Like, he was like, come on, girl.
The Lord
Come in my
said-
mama's tent.
The
Come
Lord
on.
said, God
Yeah.
said, if God blessed this and did it, I ain't got no argument.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, she my wife. That's what it says to me.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's good. Good. Well, thank you all for your thoughts and appreciate you guys joining us. We only had 3 chapters today, so a little brief, but we'll be right back tomorrow with I think we're on day 10 tomorrow, so look forward to seeing you then.
Thank you for joining us for the VIBEZ Daily podcast. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or download our favorite, the VIBEZ Church app. Visit vibes.church/devoted for additional episodes, notes, details, and the latest merch. Join us next time as we continue our journey through the